The unexpected passenger. The morning air was crisp and clean as the city stirred to life, a light breeze lifting the fallen leaves that had begun to blanket the sidewalks. Bert Sullivan, a bus driver with more than 2 decades behind the wheel of the number 15 route, adjusted his cap and settled into his seat with a small smile. He loved his job, the steady routine, and the familiar faces that kept him company along his route. His bus was a mini world of sorts, filled with characters who came and went, each with their quirks and silent stories. Today seemed like it would be just another day. Bert's route stretched from the quiet suburbs into the heart of the city, where people bustled with purpose, their lives interweaving in ways they rarely noticed. Every weekday morning, he welcomed an array of passengers who relied on him to get them where they needed to go. He knew most of them by name, or at least by sight, and he prided himself on being more than just a driver. He was a friend, a listener, and, at times, a confidant. First was Mrs. Conway, a petite, elderly woman with a penchant for wearing extravagant hats and carrying her crochet bag. She always took a seat right behind Bert, settling in with a contented sigh. Mrs. Conway loved to talk, often filling the air with tales of her late husband or the goings-on in her knitting club. Then came Daniel, a young accountant with a nervous smile who worked at a large, impersonal firm downtown. He'd been riding the bus since his university days, always with his headphones on and a book in his hands. Bert often teased him, calling him the professor, which made Daniel's cheeks flush with a shy smile. As the bus rolled along, picking up more passengers, Bert noticed a few children climbing aboard with their mothers, school bags slung over their shoulders. A particular favorite of his was little Jasmine, a 4-year-old with bouncy curls and bright, curious eyes. Jasmine's mother, Sarah, worked as a nurse and rarely had the energy to chat, but Jasmine's endless questions and innocent wonder filled the silence. Bert couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the odd little family he sought every day on his route. They were strangers, sure, but there was a bond there, a silent camaraderie that made Bert's day feel purposeful. He liked to believe he was making a difference, even in small ways, by providing a moment of comfort in people's busy lives. As the bus rounded a bend and stopped at a particularly busy intersection, something unusual caught Bert's eye. There, standing at the curb with a wary, pleading gaze, was a scruffy dog. Its coat was a mix of brown and gray, matted in places, and it wore a worn, faded collar that looked as though it had seen better days. The dog had a certain sadness in its eyes, a look that tugged at Bert's heart even from across the pavement. For a moment, Bert hesitated. He had never seen a dog trying to board his bus before, and he wasn't quite sure what to do. But then, as if on cue, the dog took a tentative step toward the open door, looking directly at Bert with an almost human-like plea in its eyes. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered under his breath, half amused and half concerned. He reached out a hand, his voice soft and coaxing. "Come on, fella. It's all right. You look like you could use a bit of warmth." The dog hesitated, eyeing him with cautious hope. Then, with a tentative wag of its tail, it trotted up the steps and onto the bus. It was a sight so peculiar that it immediately drew the attention of everyone on board. Mrs. Conway gasped and clutched her crochet bag to her chest, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "Oh my stars, Bert, look at this little guy. He must be lost." Daniel glanced up from his book, eyebrows raised in surprise. "Guess he didn't know where else to go," he murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. Even little Jasmine, her face pressed against the window, let out a delighted squeal. "Mommy, there's a dog on the bus. Can we keep him?" Sarah, her mother, managed a tired laugh, giving Bert a shrug. "Looks like he's picked the right bus." Bert chuckled, scratching the dog behind its ears. "Looks like you've got yourself a whole fan club here, buddy," he said, patting the dog gently. "Where are you headed?" The dog tilted its head, looking up at Bert with an expression that seemed to hold a story of its own. There was something about its demeanor, a quiet sadness mixed with hope. that made Bert's heart ache. He couldn't shake the feeling that this dog had been through something, that it needed more than just a ride. With a shrug, Bert decided that the dog could stay. It was a cold morning, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving the poor creature out on the streets. He glanced at his passengers and gave a quick nod. "All right, folks," he announced, his voice carrying a note of warmth. "Looks like we got ourselves a new passenger. Everyone, meet." He paused, thinking for a moment before deciding on a name. "Charlie. Let's call him Charlie." There were murmurs of approval from the passengers, some chuckling, others nodding with smiles. Even Daniel, usually buried in his books, seemed intrigued. It was as if the appearance of this little dog had brought a spark of energy to the bus, uniting everyone in their shared curiosity. As the bus continued on its route, Charlie seemed to settle in, curling up on the floor near Bert's seat. He watched the passengers with a calm, almost knowing gaze, his tail giving a gentle wag whenever someone smiled at him. It was as if he knew that this group of strangers, brought together by circumstance, was his chance at finding something he'd been missing. The hours passed, and with each stop, Bert noticed the subtle changes in his passengers. They seemed lighter, more engaged, as if Charlie's presence had lifted an invisible weight from their shoulders. Mrs. Conway was especially taken with him, leaning down to coo at him and occasionally slipping him small treats from her bag. Bert couldn't help but smile, feeling the surge of affection for his little band of misfits. It was strange, he thought, how a simple dog could transform the mood on the bus, creating a sense of connection among people who might have otherwise never spoken to each other. In that small rolling space, they weren't just strangers anymore. They were something closer, something kinder. And yet, as the day wore on, Bert couldn't shake the feeling that Charlie was searching for something. Every now and then the dog would lift his head, gazing out the window with a faraway look in his eyes, as if hoping to see a familiar face or place. Bert wondered about his story. Where had he come from? Who had he belonged to? And, more importantly, what was he hoping to find? As the bus made its final turn and the day drew to a close, Bert felt a pang of sadness. He didn't know what would happen next for Charlie, but he knew one thing for sure. This little dog had brought something magical to his day, something he would never forget. The mystery of Charlie. The day after the scruffy, sad-eyed dog boarded Bert's bus for the first time, he couldn't shake the memory. Charlie, as Bert had decided to call him, had left an indelible mark on both Bert and the passengers. That night, as Bert lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he kept thinking about the lost dog's deep, soulful gaze, the way it seemed to hide a story too complex for words. When he returned to his route the following day, Bert hoped he might see Charlie again. He'd spent the morning with an unusual mixture of anticipation and worry. He'd even thought about the collar Charlie wore, worn and weathered, yet not quite what you'd expect of a typical stray. Was there an owner somewhere out there searching desperately for him? By mid-morning, Bert had nearly given up on seeing Charlie again. The bus was filled with the familiar faces, the elderly Mrs. Conway, with her crochet needles clicking softly, Daniel with his nose in a book, Jasmine and her mother, Sarah, sitting by the window. And yet, as the bus rolled along, Bert kept casting glances at the sidewalk, scanning for a small figure with a faded collar and sad eyes. Then, at the corner of 7th and Main, as the bus slowed to a stop, Bert spotted a familiar shape darting through the crosswalk, just a little gray blur moving through the morning crowd. His heart skipped a beat. "There he is," he whispered, barely able to contain his excitement. Sure enough, it was Charlie, trotting along the sidewalk, his eyes darting around as if he were searching for something. Bert opened the doors, half hoping, half doubting that the dog would notice him. But to his surprise, Charlie stopped, looked up, and after a moment of hesitation, bounded over to the bus, his tail giving a faint, hopeful wag. "Well, Charlie, looks like you're back for round 2, Bert said, his tone a mix of amusement and relief. Charlie climbed aboard, casting an almost shy glance around at the familiar faces. The passengers were just as thrilled to see him as Bert was. Mrs. Conway let out a delighted laugh, reaching into her bag for a biscuit she'd saved just in case he returned. "Back for more, I see," she said, bending down to offer Charlie the treat. He took it gently, his tail giving a slightly more enthusiastic wag. "Maybe he's decided to make the bus his home," Daniel suggested, a rare smile breaking across his face. Bert couldn't shake the feeling that Charlie wasn't just here for treats or a warm seat. There was a purpose to the dog's actions, something deeper that made Bert wonder if this wasn't just a series of coincidences. Charlie's gaze was still searching, darting from passenger to passenger, window to window, as if he were looking for something or someone. The day passed in a similar rhythm. Charlie nestled at Bert's feet, occasionally lifting his head to observe the people who came and went. By now, the little dog had become something of a mascot for the number 15 route. Passengers greeted him with smiles, and a few even stopped to pet him or offer him scraps of food. But every now and then, Bert would catch that faraway look in Charlie's eyes, and his heart would ache a little, wondering what the dog was thinking. At the end of his shift, Bert was left with a dilemma. He couldn't, in good conscience, leave Charlie to wander the streets. Yet he didn't know if he should take him home. What if Charlie's owner was out there, still searching? What if Charlie was only here because he didn't know where else to go? Bert felt torn, his thoughts swirling in a jumble of possibilities. As the last passenger stepped off the bus, Bert looked down at Charlie, who sat expectantly at his feet, as if sensing Bert's thoughts. The dog tilted his head, giving Bert a look that seemed to say, "What now?" "Well, Charlie," Bert sighed, scratching the back of his neck, "looks like you're coming home with me tonight." Charlie didn't need any more encouragement. He gave an eager wag of his tail and followed Bert off the bus, trotting at his side with a newfound sense of purpose. As they made their way through the city streets toward Bert's small apartment, Bert couldn't help but feel a strange sense of happiness. He hadn't had a pet since he was a young boy, and somehow the idea of coming home to a companion, even a temporary one, filled him with warmth. When they reached Bert's apartment, Charlie seemed to settle in almost immediately. He sniffed around, inspecting every corner with a careful, deliberate air, as though he were cataloging the space. Bert watched him with a smile, feeling a growing sense of attachment. Later that evening, Bert sat on his couch, watching TV with Charlie curled up at his feet. He absent-mindedly patted the dog's head, feeling a comfort he hadn't realized he was missing. For the first time in years, Bert felt a sense of companionship that went beyond his daily routine. He knew Charlie couldn't talk, but somehow, the dog's presence was enough to fill the silence that usually filled his apartment. As the night wore on, Bert started to think about the life Charlie might have had before he boarded the bus. The dog's worn collar hinted at a past, perhaps a family that had loved him, or an owner who'd taken care of him once. Bert began to wonder if there was any way he could find out where Charlie came from. He thought of making a flyer, maybe posting about the dog on social media, or taking him to a vet to see if he had a microchip. But as he sat there, stroking Charlie's head, he hesitated. Part of him didn't want to let go. It was a selfish thought, he knew, but after just one day with Charlie, he couldn't imagine his life without him. That night, Bert drifted off to sleep with Charlie curled up at the foot of his bed. He'd decided to keep the dog with him for now, just until he could figure out what to do. But deep down, he wondered if Charlie had already decided that he was exactly where he needed to be. The next morning, Bert was up early, preparing for his shift, and Charlie followed him out the door without hesitation. It was as if the dog had been by his side forever. As they walked to the bus depot, Bert couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something extraordinary. When Bert's shift started, Charlie once again took his place at the front of the bus. The passengers greeted him like an old friend, each offering a smile or a kind word as they boarded. As the bus moved through the city, Bert felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. Charlie seemed to have become a bridge, connecting people who would otherwise pass each other by without a second thought. By the time the bus reached the edge of the city, Bert noticed something odd. Charlie's ears perked up, and his body tensed, as if he'd suddenly caught a scent on the breeze. Bert slowed the bus, glancing down at the dog with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. Charlie didn't respond, but his gaze was fixed out the window, his eyes wide and focused. Bert couldn't see anything unusual outside, but the dog's reaction was unmistakable. It was the same searching look he'd had when he first boarded the bus. Bert felt a chill run down his spine. He knew, somehow, that this was important. The search begins. The moment hung in the air like a delicate thread. Bert could feel the intensity of Charlie's focus, his entire body taut with anticipation as he stared out the window. Whatever had caught the dog's attention was somewhere beyond the glass, invisible to the human eye, but unmistakably significant to Charlie. The bus idled as Bert tried to make sense of the dog's reaction. Passengers shifted in their seats, casting curious glances at the small, scruffy dog who had suddenly become the center of attention. "Is he all right, Bert?" asked Mrs. Conway, leaning forward, her eyes filled with concern. Bert scratched his head, feeling both protective and slightly mystified. "I'm not sure," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "But I think we'd better follow his lead. There's something he's sensing out there, something important." Bert eased the bus back into gear, deciding to drive slowly down the street, following the dog's gaze as he carefully watched Charlie's reactions. With each block, Charlie's anticipation seemed to build, his body tense and alert. Bert had no clear idea where he was going, but he trusted Charlie's instinct. After all, Charlie hadn't been wrong about seeking out help when he first boarded the bus. Maybe now he was trying to lead them somewhere, someplace that held the answers they were all looking for. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, some intrigued, others mildly skeptical. But to Bert's surprise, none of them objected to the detour. By now, everyone on the route felt invested in the little dog's story. The bus had become a strange but beautiful tapestry of lives woven together by this unusual journey. After a few blocks, the bus came to a neighborhood Bert didn't usually pass through, a small residential area with rows of townhouses and quiet, tree-lined streets. As they turned a corner, Charlie's reaction grew even stronger. He jumped to his feet, his tail wagging furiously as he pressed his nose against the window. There, that's got to be it," Bert said with a renewed sense of purpose. He pulled the bus to the curb and opened the doors, unsure of what to expect. Charlie didn't wait for an invitation. He leaped down the steps and took off down the sidewalk, his paws patting urgently against the concrete. "Wait, Charlie," Bert called, scrambling to follow him. "Where are you going?" To his surprise, the passengers began to follow, each of them as curious and eager as Bert to find out what the little dog was searching for. Mrs. Conway clutched her crochet bag, her eyes shining with excitement. Jasmine tugged on her mother's hand, practically bouncing with curiosity, while Daniel brought up the rear, his book tucked under his arm as he peered around with cautious interest. Charlie led them down a quiet lane, his nose to the ground as he zigzagged between trees and fences, sniffing intently. Finally, he stopped in front of an old, faded house at the end of the block. The house had a certain melancholy charm. Its paint was peeling, and the windows were slightly fogged with age. But there were flowers in the garden, a sign that someone still cared for the place. Charlie barked softly, looking back at Bert as if to say, "This is it." The group stood outside the house, a strange mix of strangers and new friends drawn together by the mystery of a lost dog. Bert stepped forward, his heart pounding as he knocked on the door, unsure of what they might find. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind smile. She looked at the small crowd on her doorstep with a mix of confusion and surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. Bert cleared his throat, feeling a little silly. We're here because of him," he said, gesturing to Charlie, who was now sitting patiently by his feet, looking up at the woman with an intensity that surprised even Bert. The woman's gaze shifted to Charlie, and her eyes widened in recognition. She knelt down, reaching out a trembling hand, her face a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. "Charlie," she whispered, her voice catching. Charlie responded instantly, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. He stepped forward, pressing his head against the woman's hand, a soft whimper escaping his throat. The woman let out a small choked sob, pulling him close and burying her face in his fur. The relief and joy in her expression were unmistakable, and it was clear that she and Charlie shared a bond that ran deep. The crowd watched in respectful silence, each person feeling the weight of the moment. Bert's heart swelled with a mixture of happiness and sorrow, realizing that Charlie had finally found what he was looking for. This was his home. This woman was his family. After a few moments, the woman looked up, wiping her tears, and giving Bert a grateful smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd lost him for good. Charlie's been missing for weeks. I've looked everywhere, put up posters, but I'd almost given up hope." Bert nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Charlie found us," he said softly. "He got on my bus and somehow led us here. It was like he knew we'd help him get back home." The woman's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He's been my companion for years. After my husband passed, it was just the two of us. I don't know what I would have done without him." She looked down at Charlie, her expression a mix of relief and love. "Thank you all for bringing him back to me." Mrs. Conway, ever the sentimental soul, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It was our pleasure, dear," she said. "This little fellow brought us together in the most remarkable way." Daniel, usually reserved and quiet, even managed a small smile. "Yeah, I never thought a dog could bring so many people together," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Jasmine tugged on her mother's sleeve, her eyes wide with wonder. "Mommy, does this mean Charlie's a hero?" Sarah smiled, ruffling her daughter's hair. "I think so, sweetheart. Charlie's our hero today." Bert felt a surge of pride, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Somehow, this simple bus ride had turned into something extraordinary. He had seen people come together, share laughter and tears, all because of a lost dog who knew where he needed to go. As the group began to disperse, saying their goodbyes and sharing smiles, the woman, Charlie's owner, invited Bert and a few others inside for a cup of tea. Bert hesitated, glancing at his watch, but something in her eyes told him that this moment was worth savoring. Inside, the house was filled with photos, each one a snapshot of a life well lived. Bert noticed a framed picture on the mantelpiece, a younger version of the woman, smiling alongside a man and a much younger Charlie. The photo radiated warmth, a silent testament to the family they had once been. Over tea, the woman, whose name was Laura, shared stories of her life with Charlie, painting a picture of love and companionship that had carried her through difficult times. The group listened with rapt attention, each person feeling the beauty of the bond between Laura and her dog. As the evening grew late, Bert finally rose to leave, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Laura walked him to the door, her expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you again, Bert," she said softly. "I don't know how I could ever repay you for bringing him back to me." Bert shook his head, smiling gently. "No need for thanks. Charlie was the one who led us to you. He's the real hero here." As he left, Bert cast one last look at Charlie, who was curled up by Laura's feet, content and at peace. The journey had come full circle, and Charlie was home, right where he belonged. That night, as Bert lay in bed, he found himself smiling. The bus, once just a job and a routine, had become a vessel of something larger, something almost magical. He realized that he hadn't just helped reunite a lost dog with his owner. He had witnessed the power of connection, the way a simple act of kindness could ripple through lives in ways he hadn't thought possible. The unexpected reunion. A week had passed since the heartwarming reunion between Charlie and his owner, Laura. For Bert, the memory of that day lingered like a pleasant fragrance, filling him with warmth whenever he thought about it. The usual humdrum of his daily route had resumed, but somehow things felt different. There was a new energy among the passengers, a subtle yet undeniable bond that connected them in the aftermath of that shared experience. Bert had noticed that even the regulars on his bus seemed changed. Mrs. Conway, who usually kept to herself, had started bringing small bags of homemade cookies to share with the passengers. Daniel, the reserved young accountant, had grown a little bolder, sometimes engaging in quiet conversations instead of burying his nose in his book. And Jasmine, the little girl with boundless curiosity, now always seemed to have a story or a drawing to show Bert, as if eager to add a little magic to his day. But as much as the newfound camaraderie pleased him, Bert couldn't help but feel a sense of longing for the scruffy, soulful eyes of Charlie. He missed the dog's gentle presence and the way he had looked at Bert, as if he held secrets too profound to share. Yet he felt at peace knowing that Charlie was home, loved and safe with Laura. Bert wondered if he'd ever see them again, but he didn't dwell on it. Life, after all, had a way of moving forward. One crisp autumn morning, Bert was guiding his bus through the quiet suburban streets, lost in his thoughts as he approached a stop near a local park. The leaves had begun to turn, painting the trees with vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold. The world seemed calm, almost suspended in a gentle hush. As he waited at the stop, a figure caught his eye. A young woman, clutching a small bundle wrapped in a tattered shawl. She looked disheveled and tired, her clothes rumpled and her face drawn, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. Bert had never seen her before. She was clearly new to his route. He watched as she hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if unsure whether to board the bus. Bert gave her a gentle nod and opened the door, offering a kind smile. "Morning," he greeted her warmly. "Need a ride?" The woman managed a small, grateful smile and stepped onto the bus. She moved slowly, her gaze darting around nervously as she clutched the bundle in her arms. Bert noticed that she seemed to be cradling something fragile, something she held close with fierce protectiveness. "Just anywhere along the route, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Take a seat wherever you like," Bert replied, nodding toward the rows of seats behind him. "No rush here." As the woman took her seat, Bert noticed a few of his regulars casting curious glances in her direction. Mrs. Conway, always attuned to the needs of others, offered the woman a sympathetic smile, and Jasmine, with her wide-eyed innocence, gazed at her with undisguised curiosity. The bus continued on its route, weaving through the quiet neighborhoods and city streets. Bert's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror now and then, his curiosity piqued by the mysterious young woman. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze unfocused as she absent-mindedly rocked the bundle in her arms. Finally, at a particularly long red light, Bert couldn't help himself. He turned slightly, his voice soft and kind. "That's a sweet little one you've got there," he remarked gently. "How old?" The woman looked up, startled, as if pulled from a faraway place. She blinked, then looked down at the bundle in her arms. Slowly, she peeled back a corner of the shawl, revealing not a child, as Bert had expected, but a small puppy, frail and shivering, with big dark eyes that mirrored an unspoken sadness. Bert felt his heart clench. The puppy was small, barely more than a few months old, and it looked malnourished, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. Its tiny body trembled as it snuggled deeper into the woman's arms, seeking warmth and security. He doesn't have anyone else," the woman murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found him on the side of the road yesterday. Just abandoned, like he was nothing." Her words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the harshness some creatures faced. The passengers had all fallen silent, each one listening intently, their faces reflecting a mix of sadness and compassion. Mrs. Conway leaned over, her voice gentle and encouraging. You did a good thing, dear. The world needs more kindness like yours." The woman gave a small, shaky smile, her fingers stroking the puppy's head. "I couldn't just leave him there. But I don't have much. I can barely take care of myself. I don't know what I'm going to do with him." Bert felt a wave of empathy for the woman. She was clearly struggling, burdened by her circumstances, yet her heart was big enough to extend love to a helpless creature in need. He cleared his throat, his voice soft as he spoke. "What's his name?" he asked, hoping to lift her spirits even a little. "I haven't given him one yet," she replied, her gaze dropping to the puppy. "I didn't want to get too attached. I don't even know if I can keep him." Daniel, the young accountant, spoke up for the first time. "Maybe he's meant to be with you. Sometimes life brings us exactly what we need, even if we don't think we're ready for it." The woman looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Do you think so?" Bert smiled, nodding. "I think he's lucky to have found you. And maybe, just maybe, you're exactly what he needs too." The bus continued on its route, and the passengers resumed their quiet conversations. But the atmosphere had shifted. There was an unspoken sense of unity, a shared understanding that they were all part of something bigger, something connected by threads of compassion and empathy. As they reached the edge of the city, Bert suddenly had an idea. He knew it was a bit unusual, maybe even a little impulsive, but the thought wouldn't leave him. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the woman. "If you're free for a bit, there's someone I'd like you to meet. I think it might help." The woman looked at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But there was something in Bert's expression that reassured her, and she nodded slowly. "All right." Bert steered the bus off its usual path, taking a small detour down a tree-lined street. The other passengers didn't mind. In fact, they seemed intrigued by this new turn of events. A few minutes later, they arrived in front of Laura's house, the small, charming house with the peeling paint and the welcoming flowers in the garden. The woman looked at him questioningly, but Bert just gave her a reassuring nod. "Come on, you'll see." They made their way up the pathway, and before Bert could even knock, the door opened. Laura stood there, her eyes widening in surprise and delight at the sight of Bert and the crowd of passengers behind him. "Bert, what a wonderful surprise!" she exclaimed, her smile lighting up her face. Then her gaze shifted to the woman beside him and the small, trembling puppy in her arms. Her expression softened instantly, her eyes filling with understanding. "Oh, you poor thing," Laura murmured, reaching out to gently stroke the puppy's head. "Come inside, all of you. Let's get some warmth in you." Inside, Laura led them to a cozy living room filled with warmth and light. Charlie, who had been napping on his bed in the corner, lifted his head, his tail thumping excitedly when he recognized Bert and some of the passengers. Laura offered everyone tea, and the passengers settled in comfortably, exchanging quiet smiles and whispers. As the young woman sat down, Laura focused her attention on her, her gaze filled with kindness. "I've been where you are," Laura said softly. "I know what it's like to feel lost, to wonder if you're capable of taking care of someone else when you're barely hanging on yourself." The young woman's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to keep him. I want to be there for him. But I'm scared." Laura took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Love is a powerful thing. When we give it, we receive strength we didn't know we had. Sometimes, all it takes is one little soul to remind us of our own resilience." Charlie patted over, sitting beside the woman and the puppy, giving her an encouraging nuzzle. The puppy stirred, lifting his tiny head and letting out a soft yawn. It was a simple gesture, but somehow it felt like a promise, a reassurance that everything would be okay. In that moment, something shifted in the young woman. She looked down at the puppy, her expression softening with newfound resolve. I think I'll call him Hope," she whispered, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Because he's given me hope, even when I didn't know I needed it." The room was filled with a gentle silence, a moment of shared understanding that needed no words. They had all come together through the most unexpected of circumstances, their lives intertwined in ways none of them could have anticipated. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, Bert felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that Charlie's journey, though it had ended with Laura, had somehow set in motion a chain of kindness and connection. Each of them had been touched, their lives altered by the simple presence of a dog with an unbreakable spirit. That day, as Bert drove the bus back along its familiar route, he knew that this was more than just a job. It was a reminder that sometimes life brought us exactly who we needed, just when we needed them most. A community united. A few more weeks passed after the day Bert introduced the young woman, Megan, to Laura and reunited her with Charlie. Megan and her new puppy, Hope, had quickly become regulars on the number 15 route, and Bert's bus was now brimming with a sense of unity that went far beyond the simple routines of daily transit. The passengers had become a community, each one carrying a story, a connection, and a piece of one another's lives. Bert felt that his bus was like a lifeline that bound people together. It was no longer just a vehicle, but a place where stories grew, compassion blossomed, and strangers became friends. Megan had confided to Bert that her life had been difficult. She'd recently lost her job, and without any family to turn to, she had been on the verge of homelessness. Hope, the tiny puppy, had been her only comfort. When she held him close, she felt she wasn't alone in the world anymore. And now, through the community that had formed around Bert's bus, Megan had found a glimmer of hope, something to keep her grounded. One crisp evening, as Bert was preparing to end his shift, he noticed that the bus was unusually crowded. Word of Megan's story had spread, and many of the regulars had come with small gifts and gestures of kindness for her and Hope. Mrs. Conway had knitted a little sweater for Hope, a tiny blue garment with a small heart stitched on the back. Daniel had brought Megan a stack of books, carefully selected titles about finding strength and hope, along with a small envelope filled with job listings he'd handpicked, thinking they might help her start over. Jasmine had brought a drawing she'd made of Hope, a charming little portrait that captured the puppy's wide, innocent eyes. The bus had become a gathering place, a haven where people shared their stories, hopes, and dreams. As Bert guided the bus along its familiar route, the passengers chatted, laughed, and shared pieces of their lives. The bus was alive with a sense of warmth and unity that Bert could never have imagined when he first started his job. But there was something else, too, a quiet, growing desire among the passengers to do something more, something lasting that would help not only Megan and Hope, but others who might be struggling as well. After all, they knew that Megan's story wasn't unique. The city was full of people who were on the edge, one small step away from losing everything. They wanted to make a difference, to create something that would live beyond their daily rides together. One evening, just as the bus was making its way through the heart of the city, Mrs. Conway turned to the rest of the passengers with a twinkle in her eye. "You know," she began, her voice carrying a note of mischief, "I've been thinking. We've got something special here, something that's hard to find these days. Maybe it's time we put it to good use." The other passengers looked at her, intrigued. Bert watched from his seat, curious about what she had in mind. Mrs. Conway continued, her eyes shining. "I think we should start a fund, something small but meaningful, to help people like Megan who find themselves in tough situations. We can call it the Hope Fund, named after this little fellow here," she said, nodding toward the puppy who was snoozing in Megan's lap. "It doesn't have to be much, just something to help people get back on their feet." The bus fell into a hush as the passengers absorbed her words. One by one, faces lit up with understanding, their expressions a mix of surprise and excitement. "That's a wonderful idea," Daniel murmured, his usual reserved demeanor softened by a smile. "We can all contribute a little. It doesn't have to be a lot, but if we all pitch in, it could make a real difference." Jasmine's mother, Sarah, nodded enthusiastically. "We could even set up a little donation box here on the bus. Anyone who wants to help can contribute." Bert felt a surge of pride and admiration for his passengers. They had become a family of sorts, bound together not by blood, but by a shared belief in kindness and compassion. He knew that this was more than just a passing idea. It was the beginning of something beautiful and lasting. The next day, Mrs. Conway arrived with a small hand-painted box labeled Hope Fund in elegant cursive. She placed it at the front of the bus, just beside Bert's seat, and the sight of it filled him with a sense of purpose. As passengers boarded, some slipped bills or coins into the box. Others simply smiled, their eyes bright with gratitude. The Hope Fund became a symbol of their shared commitment to helping others, a reminder that even in a bustling city, kindness could thrive. Days turned into weeks, and the Hope Fund continued to grow. Passengers came and went, some giving what they could, others leaving notes of encouragement for Megan and Hope. The small community on the number 15 route had become something of a legend among the locals. People spoke of the kindness that lived on that bus, the way strangers had come together to create something meaningful. The Hope Fund had taken on a life of its own, its impact spreading beyond the bus, reaching people who had never even stepped foot on it. But the fund was only the beginning. Inspired by the unity on the bus, a few passengers started organizing monthly meetings at a nearby community center. They called it the Circle of Hope, a gathering where people could come to share their struggles, seek support, and offer whatever they could to help one another. Bert was humbled to see how a single act of kindness, Charlie's journey back to Laura, had blossomed into something so powerful, something that brought out the best in people. Megan, who had once been shy and withdrawn, began attending the meetings as well. Her confidence grew with each passing week, bolstered by the kindness and support she received. With the help of Daniel's job listings and a bit of coaching from Mrs. Conway, she eventually found a position at a local animal shelter. It was a modest job, but one that allowed her to be surrounded by animals, a place where she could give love and care to creatures who had known hardship, just like she and Hope had. The first time Megan shared the news of her new job with the bus community, the bus erupted in cheers and applause. Bert could see the pride and joy in her eyes, a quiet glow that spoke of resilience and newfound strength. As the months passed, the Circle of Hope continued to expand. People who had once been strangers now came together regularly, each person contributing in their own way. They organized clothing drives for the homeless, created care packages for families in need, and even hosted events to raise money for local shelters. The Hope Fund had grown far beyond its humble beginnings, becoming a beacon of kindness that spread throughout the city. And then, one chilly morning in December, Bert arrived at work to find a small envelope taped to the front of the bus. It was addressed simply to the Hope Bus. Curious, Bert opened it and found a letter, written in neat, careful handwriting. To the people of the Hope Bus, I don't know any of you, but I've heard about what you've done. I lost my job a few months ago, and it's been a struggle to keep going. There were days when I didn't know if I'd make it, days when I felt completely alone. But hearing about the Hope Fund, the kindness you've shown to one another, has given me something I haven't felt in a long time. Hope. It's people like you who remind the world that kindness still exists, that even strangers can make a difference. Thank you for showing me that I'm not alone. You've given me a reason to keep going. With gratitude, a friend you've never met. Bert's hands trembled as he read the letter, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He shared the letter with the passengers that morning, and as they passed it around, he could see the tears in their eyes, the quiet smiles that spoke of understanding and unity. The Hope Bus had become more than just a means of transportation. It had become a symbol of compassion, a testament to the power of community and the impact of small, selfless acts. Each day, Bert watched as passengers boarded his bus with renewed purpose, their eyes bright with the knowledge that they were part of something beautiful, something that transcended the simple ride from one stop to another. And as the snow began to fall gently over the city, Bert felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that, in some small way, they were all carrying a piece of Charlie's journey with them, a reminder that, sometimes, All it took was a little hope to change the world. A legacy of hope. Winter had settled over the city, blanketing it in a soft, shimmering coat of snow. Frost edged the windows of Bert's bus as he made his way along the number 15 route, his breath creating small clouds in the crisp morning air. Despite the cold, a sense of warmth radiated from within the bus, an invisible yet powerful bond that connected everyone who boarded. The Hope Bus, as it had come to be affectionately known, was now something of a legend. People from other routes would occasionally ride just to experience it, eager to see for themselves the community that had blossomed here. Local newspapers had picked up the story, sharing tales of the kindness and compassion that had transformed a simple city bus into a moving symbol of unity. Even tourists sometimes made a point to hop on, curious about the place where strangers had become family, all thanks to a lost dog named Charlie and a group of everyday people who chose to make a difference. The Hope Fund continued to grow, and with it, so did the impact of the Circle of Hope. Megan had become a pillar of the group, her gentle strength and newfound confidence inspiring others who were going through difficult times. She'd recently taken on a leadership role at the animal shelter, her bond with Hope giving her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. For Megan, life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined, and she credited it all to the kindness she'd found on Bert's bus. As the bus trundled along on that snowy morning, Bert couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them all here. The passengers had changed over time, with new faces joining the familiar ones, but the spirit of kindness remained. Mrs. Conway still rode with her handmade treats. Jasmine had grown taller and was now a budding artist who regularly gifted drawings to passengers, and even Daniel had transformed, his once reticent demeanor now open and warm. The city outside, blanketed in white, felt like a canvas, a fresh start. And in the quiet moments between stops, as he drove through the snowy streets, Bert allowed himself to dream about what the Hope Fund might become in the years to come. His musings were interrupted by a loud ding as the bus came to a halt at one of its regular stops. A young man stepped on, stamping snow from his boots. He looked around the bus, a little uncertain, but when he saw the friendly faces and felt the warmth that seemed to pulse through the vehicle, he relaxed and took a seat near the front. Bert, ever curious and welcoming, turned to the young man with a smile. First time on the Hope Bus. The man gave a shy nod, his eyes taking in the passengers who were chatting softly and exchanging small gestures of kindness. "I've heard about this bus," he replied, his voice laced with awe. "A friend told me it was, well, different. Special, even." The words touched Bert deeply. He'd always believed that his bus, his route, was just a job. But now, he realized it was something more, a vessel of hope, connection, and humanity. He nodded, feeling the weight of those words and the responsibility that came with them. "That's right," Bert said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is a bus where strangers become friends and where a little kindness goes a long way." The young man's eyes softened, and he leaned back, allowing himself to be swept up in the quiet magic of the Hope Bus. As they continued along the route, he watched with fascination as the regulars greeted each other, exchanged stories, and even shared their troubles without fear of judgment. He'd never seen anything quite like it. Just then, as if on cue, Mrs. Conway pulled a small gift from her bag and handed it to Bert. She had a mischievous glint in her eye as she handed over the little parcel wrapped in red paper. "Don't think I'd forget my favorite driver," she said, winking. "Merry Christmas, Bert." Bert felt his heart swell as he unwrapped the gift to reveal a small hand-knitted scarf in a deep, warm shade of blue. He looked down at it, touched by the gesture, and turned to Mrs. Conway with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Conway," he said, tying the scarf around his neck. "It's perfect." The rest of the passengers joined in, each offering their own small tokens of appreciation. Some had brought baked goods, others cards, and even a few small trinkets they thought Bert might enjoy. Bert was overwhelmed by their kindness, his heart full of gratitude for the people who would become his second family. Then, as the bus made its way to the last stop of the route, Bert was met with an unexpected surprise. Standing at the curb, bundled up in a warm coat and scarf, was Laura, and at her side was Charlie, who wagged his tail excitedly as the bus approached. Bert felt a surge of joy at the sight of them, a reminder of where this incredible journey had started. Laura and Charlie boarded, greeted warmly by the familiar faces. Charlie was a celebrity on the bus, after all, and the passengers couldn't resist reaching out to pet him and scratch behind his ears. Charlie, ever the humble hero, soaked up the attention with quiet grace, as if he, too, understood the importance of his role in bringing everyone together. Laura smiled at Bert, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "We just wanted to come by and say thank you," she said softly. "Charlie and we owe so much to this bus. Without you, I don't know if we have ever found each other again." Bert nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's us who should be thanking you, Laura. Charlie changed all our lives. He reminded us what it means to care for one another." Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden plaque. She handed it to Bert, her smile filled with warmth. "I had this made for you. For all of you, really." Bert took the plaque and read the inscription. It was simple, but its message was profound. "The Hope Bus, where strangers become family, and kindness is the fare." The words struck him deeply, each one a testament to the legacy of compassion that had blossomed here. Bert felt his eyes sting with unshed tears, but he managed to smile, lifting the plaque for everyone to see. A cheer went up from the passengers, their voices echoing through the bus, filling the space with joy and laughter. At that moment, Bert knew that the plaque belonged not just to him, but to every person who had ever ridden the Hope Bus. He resolved to mount it at the front of the bus, a reminder to all who boarded that this was more than just a ride. It was a community, a place where kindness and hope thrived. As winter gave way to spring, the Hope Fund continued to grow, its reach extending far beyond the bus. The Circle of Hope meetings flourished, becoming a place where people from all walks of life could gather, share their stories, and find support. Megan, now thriving in her role at the animal shelter, often spoke at these meetings, sharing her journey and encouraging others to find strength in their darkest hours. And Bert, the quiet driver who had once seen his job as a simple routine, found himself deeply fulfilled, knowing that he was part of something greater. Each day, he welcomed new faces, new stories, and new opportunities for connection. He never knew who might board his bus or what stories they would bring, but he welcomed each one with an open heart. Years passed, and the Hope Bus became a beloved part of the city's fabric. Children who had once ridden the bus with their parents returned as adults, now bringing their own children, sharing stories of the kindness and warmth they'd found there. People would leave small donations in the Hope Fund box, each one a silent promise to carry the spirit of the bus forward. On his final day as the driver of the Hope Bus, Bert looked out at the passengers, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They were his family, his friends, and his legacy. When he parked the bus for the last time, the passengers gathered around him, each one sharing words of thanks, small gifts, and memories of the journeys they'd shared together. Mrs. Conway presented him with a final, heartfelt gift, a small knitted square stitched with the words, "Once a family, always a family." She hugged him tightly, her eyes wet with tears. As he walked away from the bus that day, Bert felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that the Hope Bus would continue to roll through the city, carrying not just passengers, but hope, compassion, and the belief that small acts of kindness could change lives. In his heart, he carried the stories, the laughter, and the love that had filled his bus over the years. And as he walked home, he knew that wherever he went, the spirit of the Hope Bus would live on, an unbreakable legacy of compassion and community, a reminder that in a world that often felt vast and impersonal, there was always room for kindness. The Hope Bus would ride on, carrying strangers, friends, and a shared dream. that together they could create a world where hope was never in short supply and kindness was always the fare.